looking at it.
If it is an infinite loop, then you have to write down in a comment area and just say it is an infinite loop.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it is possible if you read the instructions, the initial instructions.
I see. I read that. I just wasn't sure if if that's what is that what the HTML is there for to put it in there. Okay.
Yep.
That's what I wanted to make sure before I did that. I was like looking at it.
Okay.
I thought I made a mistake.
No, if there can be infinite loop, it can access elements that are not in the array. So if any one of those conditions happen, you have to comment.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So there you go. But I think this is a pretty good resource. So I would just make sure that I put a link here into this class website, because we will be getting components. It will be a part of your assignment. And in fact, today, I'm going to go over what you have to do for this kind of project. So I'm going to use a project to replace exam number 2. I think that's not a bad trade.
I don't think so. I don't think so either. I like that idea.
I think it's more appropriate for this class. So I'm going to put a link here. And I'll call that. What's the name of that website? Passmark. Okay. So I thought this is particularly useful for this class, and also for anyone, may not be even in this class, who wants to put a system together and just want to see how components compare. Because if you look at, the comparisons, a lot of times there's not really a whole lot of differences between the components. If you look at CPUs, they have high to mid-range CPUs, which is probably what most of us will be buying. And you can see the highest performance one is about 2,000 in terms of the unit, and the lowest one down here is about 1,000. So basically, the top one is twice the processing power of the one at the bottom. But if you look at the top 5, it makes almost no difference. The top 5, is the top one is 1936, and the last one the 5th one is 1911. It is inconceivable. You cannot tell the difference unless you have a benchmarking software like this, or use a stopwatch. But you have to be running some kind of program for days for this kind of difference to show up. So I thought that's a pretty useful website. That's the first thing I want to share, and then there are some other things I find also kind of interesting over the past day or so. So one is hard drive. The other one is also related to this class, because it talks about open source as well as networking concepts. The website is called DD-WRT, which is kind of like an awful name because people cannot remember this sort of name. It only consists of consonants. There's no vowel in the name. So how do you say it? You have to spell out the letters, right? DD-WRT. So what it is an interesting thing. It is a special distribution of Linux. Okay? It is a special distribution of Linux that is optimized to be put onto an existing router. Residential gateway router. I'm not talking about Cisco stuff. I'm talking about routers that you might already have, or you can buy at a store for 30, 40, 50 bucks.
It's firmware, isn't it?
It is a firmware, but it's a Linux-based firmware that is designed to live inside one of those small devices.
Have you heard of Tomato?
Nope.
No, that's another one.
I have not been looking for stuff like this, because my router has been working just fine for many years, so I have not had the need to look into anything that's different. But this one is interesting because it is an open source project, okay? And they even have the support from hardware manufacturers. In other words, Netgear, Buffalo is a big one, okay? Buffalo is a big one. I'm not so sure about, what is the other company that Cisco owns?
Red Hat?
Linksys.
Yeah.
Linksys. I think Linksys may or may not be on their list, but Buffalo is big. Okay, Buffalo actually makes certain lines of residential gateways and routers that has this software pre-installed. So it's already done. It's already pre-installed. So you won't risk breaking your system, at least the first time. Okay, breaking means B-R-I-C-K-I-G. That means turning your router into a brick. Okay, well, it's a plastic, really lightweight kind of brick.
That's Is it a paperweight? Yeah.
Yeah, paper hardly. It's so light. These days. But the interesting thing is, you can turn your network device into just about anything now with this kind of software running on it. I was looking into a solution where I need a residential gateway, a router, to hook up to the internet service provider, and then I also need a bridge to go from Wi-Fi back into wired interface, because I have some older computers that I don't want to convert to become wireless. With older computers, you have several problems. One, you may not have the necessary slots to install an additional card. The old operating system may not support it. And three, it only supports USB 1.1, so there's no point in using wireless G or anything faster than wireless G, because USB 1.1 can only support up to 12 megabits per second, which is way slower than the network itself. Okay, so on those older computers, it makes sense to use a bridge to go from Wi-Fi back into wired interface, back into 100 megabits per second Ethernet. And I looked into the pricing of a bridge like that. There are $80 or more. I looked into a router that has DDWRT, and DDWRT can be configured to become a bridge from wireless back to wired. And that's $50. So the $50 device can act as many different things depending on how you want to configure the system. It also has IP tables, which is a really complicated firewall mechanism in Linux built into it. It's a kernel feature, so it has to be compiled in the kernel of the operating system. But it is supported by DDWRT. And the whole thing can be configured just like any other router using a web interface. You just log into your router device as if it is a website, and you can do most of the configuration that way. So I was actually impressed. I was actually impressed by the flexibility of the software. Does Tomato do all that too? Maybe it's a spin-off of a Tomato project or vice versa. But getting back to open source, if you are a hardware manufacturer, if you make residential gateways, if you make routers, Wi-Fi, how do you call those things, access points, and so on and so forth, would you support open source like this, or would you want to have your own proprietary software? How are you making your money? You're making money by selling the hardware, right? Do you want to use your money, part of your profit, and channel that into software development where you do not make money directly? If you use something like this, it's already done, right? Now, on the other hand, if you are a developer for DDWRT initially as a hobby, okay, you were a college student and you were doing a lot of stuff with networking and also the Linux kernel, you pick up this project and say, oh, this is a kind of fun thing to do and I can do it. And at some point you get out of college, you have to go find a real job. Can you turn this into an opportunity where you can actually make money? Support, exactly. So if you go to this website and you go to, I cannot remember where, there's a contribution here, okay, but you don't want to rely on contribution from, end users, because someday you can get some and someday you may not get any. Development, I cannot remember exactly where, but there was one place, it could be support here. Forum, feature request. If I remember correctly, they have a link somewhere on this website, which may or may not be easily seen here. But they offer a service, okay? They offer services to hardware manufacturers. In other words, if I'm D-Link, okay, and I say, well, I'm good at putting cheap router boxes together. I know everything about making PCBs. I know everything about injection molding, which is the case, and stuff like that. But I'm not quite sure how to put DDWRT onto the hardware that I'm designing, or I want to design some hardware that is specifically compatible with DDWRT so there won't be any issues later on. So what am I going to do? I'm not going to spend my own money on my own staff or hire a person specifically for that purpose. I'll just subcontract out and pay people with the DDWRT community and say, okay, you guys come over here and you tell me what kind of hardware is best for this software, so we can design our hardware accordingly, and tell us, what is the best image, or give me an image to burn onto the flash EEPROM of my devices, so my devices will be ready to go, from day one, off the shelf. So that's how people can make money from open source software. It is not money made from licensing the software, but from the service of upgrading the software, customizing the software, or offering advice to hardware manufacturers in this case to make sure the hardware is compatible and also works well with the software. In other words, the software people can say, well, I guess you can run with 8 megabytes of RAM, but having 16 is really, really good because then we can expand the capabilities without running up into limitations. Then the hardware manufacturer can look at the price and go like, okay, going from 8 megabytes to 16 megabytes, we increased the cost of the system by $2 or $3, but at least now we can claim that the device will be very expandable in the future. Is it worth the extra cost? Maybe, maybe not, but at least they have an option. They have, the advice from the software people telling them, if you give me this much resources, we can do this. If you give us this much resources, we can do that, and so on. So I was actually somewhat impressed. I just bought a $70 Buffalo device, which has DDWRT built into it. It comes with a USB port. Can anyone guess what the USB port is for?
Storage attached.
Yep, for NAS, for network attached storage. In other words, with that router, I can go get an inexpensive USB external hard drive, and now it is now a network attached storage. You can probably do the same thing with printer sharing, because Linux is not limiting only to use the USB port for Samba. You can also use it to share like printer devices and whatnot. It is entirely up to the software to decide what it can do with that one USB port. Now with a USB port, you can always hook it up to a USB hub, and then from the hub, you can attach multiple devices. It will be slower once you go through a hub, but nonetheless, it is possible. So we are talking about a lot of flexibilities for free software, and it can now be purchased pre-installed on certain routers. And there was a time where, when manufacturers were resisting open source, or they hid the fact that they were using open source. I cannot remember which manufacturer, but people found out that they were using open source software, they were making changes to it, and they did not play by the rules of the GPL. Okay. Any questions about this one? No questions? Because I was already in the market for a wireless N device. I was actually somewhat surprised by the price of wireless N routers, Wi-Fi routers. I thought they were still in the $100+ dollar range, and as it turned out, they're $50 or even less now. And that gives you about 300 megabits per second of transfer speed under optimal conditions, as opposed to 54 megabits per second of wireless G. How many people have wireless N at home? And you guys are way ahead of me. I have wireless G, and that was sufficient for going online, but now I want to use one single computer in the house to back up everything else. Going through a 54 megabits per second, in theory, network to back up a 160 gig hard drive is extremely painful.
I can't convince my family to get a new router. I can't convince my family to get a new router.
Well, you just have to tell them if with a new router you can back up the files more frequently, and if they don't listen, you just have to wait until one of the hard drives die. Then they'll come back to you and say, please upgrade the router now.